Okay, so today we're going to talk about this book by Francois Hertog, The Mirror of Herodotus. So I assigned this book for a couple of reasons. One, since this is the week that, and the reason I gave you the section I did, this is the week where we're considering what existed before race was the predominant form of difference, right? So this is a snapshot of what we could say would be like the ideological orientation of ancient Greeks. And really, so the book, just to give you an idea of how it's structured in general, so Hertog has the entire book broken into two sections, the first of which is a close reading of the historian Herodotus. The second half of it is essentially the theoretical things that he creates out of that reading. So I wanted to assign this because I felt like without having you guys read the second half, we could move in that direction. And so this would get us really ready to do something that's going to be really important in this class, which is thinking about the concept. So if you remember the first day I threw out three concepts. One was ethnicity, one was race, and the other is difference. Right? And this really gets us thinking about, will get us thinking about by the end, how difference works, right? Because there's something very specific. This word difference in particular, we will use this word throughout the class a lot. Other or the other, right, are really important terms which within academia for analyzing really any form of difference, but in this case, differences on the basis of race and ethnicity. So we're going to move towards that. And Francois Hertog is most famous for what he refers to as the rhetorics of otherness. We'll see what that means. So where last week we kind of focused mostly on how ancient societies before modernity in general, are different in their orientation towards difference, right, towards the other. In this class, we're both going to focus on how it's different as well as how it's similar, right? Because there's some huge similarities that he picks up on, and particularly at how we talk about other people across time and space. Okay, so with that as our sort of segue, let's dig into the chapter. So I gave you guys a section called The Question of Nomadism. This is the conclusion to that first half, right? That first half that specifically does this reading of Herodotus. Has anybody ever heard of Herodotus before? Okay, so we'll definitely have to talk about that. What do you guys know about ancient Greeks? I know it's a really random question, especially in a sociology class. Not in a history class. What do you guys know about ancient Greeks?
They were like really into like art and like music.
Yeah, they did a lot of art, you know, we still see plays performed. Has anybody ever seen an ancient Greek play performed? A lot of college campuses will do this. I don't know, like Women of Troy or something like that, right? There's a lot of like ancient Greek plays, etc. Okay, what else do you know about Greeks?
They were divided up into city-states.
Yeah, they lived in city-states, right? Which for that time is kind of a big thing, right? Like still. Okay, what else? Does anybody know what kind of government they practiced?
Democracy.
Yeah, so Greeks were generally practiced democracy, not all Greek city-states, but the ones that were more influential on how we think of Greeks today are generally come from democracies, right? Okay. Anything else people know about Greeks? Anybody here have to read any Greek literature when you're in like high school or anything, like the Iliad or the Odyssey? I see a couple nods. What are those things like?
It's like kind of like bizarre stories.
Elaborate. What do you mean by bizarre?
Well, there was like a lot of like mythical like creatures and stuff in there. I felt like, and stuff that like I don't really think happens. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, so they have a certain mythical orientation towards the world. People of the past generally do. You know, what else? What else kind of strikes you as odd about it? I always am struck by just how like sheerly violent it is. There's a lot of violence in pretty much everything Greeks wrote, right? Like, you know, there's people being like, you know, having their organs strung out, or like a guy carrying somebody's dead body around for 8 days, right? Just like riding around with it, right? Because he doesn't want to let it go. And there's people like, you know, there's rape and people lighting themselves on fire, and there's like all kinds of horrible stuff. Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's written that way?
Because like that's how their culture was.
Yeah, it's a big part of their culture. Like it's very like sort of warfare-driven culture, and the structure that they have is on the basis of that often, right? The social classes within their society, the basic social classes are sort of like peasants, a warrior class, right, an leading class, you know, essentially a ruling class. So okay, so just kind of like get us in the right mindset. So Herodotus is essentially this, we refer to him as the founder of history often, but he's also as much sort of a geographer. So essentially what do historians generally do today? Where do they get their information? What do you think? Where do historians get their information from? What does historical research look like?
Like journals from the past.
Yeah, they sit down and they read old documents of one kind or another, right? And then they extrapolate what's out of that mostly. It's sort of the difference between history and archaeology. Like archaeology, like, you know, digs up, I don't know. I always felt like archaeology is just the study of broken pieces of pottery. If you've ever known an archaeologist, all they seem to talk about is pottery. Anyways, not to harass an entire discipline, right? So how do you think maybe being a historian in the time of Herodotus, we're talking about, I think it's 300 years BC? How do you think that differs?
It's probably a little more difficult, and you probably had to be the writer of the primary sources rather than relying on them.
Yeah. There's no primary source material. There's no dingy archives to go sit around with white gloves on and read it, right? Like, so basically what Herodotus does is he just travels a lot, talks to a bunch of people, and then writes this sort of like history. And the history is like, if you sat down and read Herodotus, it's incredibly weird. Like super weird, like there's like you know, stories about people whose entire civilization revolves around interacting with these giant ants the size of dogs that dig for gold, right? Like, and so like there's a lot of stuff like this, like all through like pre-modern times. There's a whole literature of like travel literature that's often like really crazy what people will claim to have seen. Even into things that we, like if you take a history class, you'll often like it'll write about it as if it's like very normal, which it was normal at its time, but to us would read really strange. Like I made reference to I'm blanking on the name all of a sudden. I have aphasia problems sometimes when I'm in front of people. I can't get words up. Marco Polo, right? Read about Marco Polo, it sounds like this very like sane account, but like he talks about seeing the Great Wall that, you know, Alexander built to keep out the half-demon people of the Gog and Magog that were going to flood the earth during the end of days, right? Like very different world orientation, if that's your version of travel literature, right? If that's your version of history. So like, there's a lot to dig into within Herodotus, and why is it that he talks about things the way he does, right? Which is kind of Herodot's starting point to discuss Herodotus. Why is it that he's presenting these people the way that he does? Okay, so in the chapter, he's looking at one specific group. So you know, Herodotus's stories, right, sort of like he writes about Africa, he writes about the Middle East, he writes about Asia, he writes about things to the north. all of which are equally kind of like sometimes bizarre, but equally uses similar language often. We're going to dig into the language of that. But Hertog decides to focus on one group. Did anybody catch what the group is? And I mean a group as in like, they probably aren't a group, wouldn't call themselves this. They probably wouldn't even identify themselves as belonging to one group of people. But what do the Greeks call them? If you read the chapter, and you can mispronounce it, okay?
The Scythians?
Yeah, Scythians. It's the Scythians. How do the Greeks describe the Scythians? What are some of their characteristics?
Like they're nomads.
They're nomads. That's a big one, right? And we already talked about there's a big distinction between nomads and a big tension there, right? So Greeks really think nomads are what? What are nomads?
Like outsiders.
They're outsiders.
They move around.
They move around a lot, but yeah, that's what they are. They do move around a lot. What do Greeks feel about that?
Like they don't like it. They just think it's like, I don't know, like uncivilized or something.
Yeah, they think that they're backwards because they're nomadic, right? They can't develop all those arts and whatnot, etc. So what else do they think about them? How else do they describe them?
They talk about how nomadism accommodates many different rules of life.
Yeah, so there's a certain like confusion to like how complex they are, and they do like he does describe a lot of different groups. I mean, this is, ancient historians like they talk about a 1,000-page book, and he writes hundreds of pages about this group and that group, and it's kind of funny. We'll get to the significance of this to some degree, but he almost begins every sentence with, "I have seen" or "I have heard," right? I have heard. Anyways. So yeah, there's a whole plethora of things that they could do. What else do we hear? Just like skim the chapter and throw out adjectives. There's groups of people that he identifies as man-eaters. So there's cannibals, right? Have you ever heard of the Amazonians? Still this works into our mythos. We even have a phrase that we use in contemporary English. Do you guys know it? It's actually the Amazon women. You guys ever hear of Amazon women? We use that as a phrase sometimes even today for like, I guess like basically if women are tall. I don't know. It's pejorative and masculine, misogynistic. But anyways, the term originally comes from this. And the Amazonians would be a type of Scythian, right? That comes out of Herodotus, right? And the idea is that, and we can think about like, what is it? Does anybody know anything about Amazon women as a group of people when we talk about them as a I guess a myth?
They're like this group of women who like, I don't think so. There wasn't like any men, and they were like warriors, I think, or something.
Yeah. The Amazon women are a society where the women are in charge. They mainly reproduce by kidnapping men, right, and then sending them off after they're done with them. They only accept female children, and otherwise don't accept that. Like don't have anyone. They, depending on what source it is, they either kill male children or they send them to some other group. And Greeks are really afraid of Amazon women, right? So but why do you think? So why do you think this? Amazon women, there's an obsession with Amazon women throughout the Middle Ages. Even that's what the reason why the Amazon is called the Amazon is because the early explorers thought that Amazon women lived in South America. So they were looking for the Amazon women, trying to figure out where they were, right? And same with he talks about these man-eaters, that continues on, right? And in fact, like the reason why it's called the Caribbean is from the word cannibal. A different version of the word cannibal, essentially. So like, you think about like the entire Amazon River basin is based off of these similar mythologies. And so is like, you know, for a long time what people thought about people. And even today, like often people will think that these people were cannibals or whatever beforehand and say that, right? So why do you think these things are so striking to people? Why do you think Herodotus writes, you know, about Amazon women 300 BC and we're 1600 years later, people are still looking for them?
Probably because of how opposite it is of the Greek way of life and the Greek civilization.
Yeah, Greeks are incredibly misogynistic. And in fact, like, do you guys know if there's a stereotype about Greek sexual behavior, it's what? What did Greeks do that most people, a lot of people like feel uncomfortable with today, or at least is politically talked about a lot today? Ancient Greeks have sex with men. Men have sex with men, right? This is like the whole bath culture thing. Anyways, if you actually like, that sounds like, and this is entirely disembedding it, because like, it's not homosexuality, because homosexuality doesn't exist until modernity, right? Like, it's a whole other conversation. But it's a practice of men having sex with men that actually revolves around the fact that men generally think that women are kind of gross and unattractive, right? Like culturally, they're not an ideal. So not only are Greeks misogynistic in the way that they think that women are mentally inferior to them and kind of only there to reproduce, but they actually don't even think that they are physically attractive or have anything to appeal in that way either. Greeks are incredibly misogynistic. You know, so like you think about that as an inversion, right? So like the Amazon woman is the complete inversion of the way that Greeks generally view women, which is why there's a little bit of an obsession with them, right? So that's one example. Did anybody catch it? There's a big section here about the political system according to Herodotus. This is actually like a contradiction that Herodotus trying to pull out. It seems like it shouldn't go together. What's the political system of these nomads?
I think you said there was like a king or something.
Yeah. So they have a despotic king. Do you know what that word means, despotic? You know what a despot is? The word we throw around still, or we throw around in English quite a bit. Despot is like basically like this sort of unfair, like in charge of everything, rules the lives of people completely, somewhat arbitrary, everything's just sort of about them, sort of leader, right? And it's usually in regards to you know, a monarch system, right? So somebody who a system where there's one person in charge. Anyways, so thinking about it, what do you guys notice anything kind of strange about teaming up, having a despotic king, and everything else we've said about nomads, either from last class and today? What's weird about that? Why does it strike you as something that's probably not very probable? Small nomadic groups having a despotic king? Why is it not very probable? Why does it seem like it's a false statement?
It kind of seem like these like free people who are kind of wandering around, and not really like even entitled. There's like a bunch of them in this big group, and so then to have this king who's like this dictator who kind of restricts that freedom, like they don't seem like those kind of people who would put up with that.
Yeah, and it's weird because at moments, if you read Herodotus, at moments he describes them as basically entirely free, doing whatever they want, roaming around the countryside, right? And then all of a sudden it's like in a different section he's just like, oh yeah, and they have this despotic king and he rules over hundreds of thousands of armies and like, you know, crushes everything underneath his feet and like, you know, kind of thing, right? And so what Herodotus wants to say is there's something very interesting to this shift. And actually this is where we can start thinking about difference, like rather than Because in the end, what are the Scythians to the Greeks? What do you think? They're their what? They're their opposite. Right? They're actually just an inversion, right? So they're just an inversion of Greeks see themselves as democratic, and the Scythians, sorry, I got out of camera range. I'm going to erase these words. Like I said, Isaac was like, how are you adjusting to teaching, like, comparing conditions? Like, it's just a lot more things to remember that I normally didn't have to, right? Like, I can't go too far to the right or else I get out of the camera. Okay. So you have the inversion. Greeks and Scythians. Right? So the Greeks are democratic. The Scythians are they have a despotic king. The Greeks are by their own definition civilized. They understand themselves as civilized, right? Mainly because they are settled. The Scythians are nomadic. The Greeks, and we talked about art, and ancient Greece is known for its philosophy, right, et cetera, et cetera. The Greeks are humanists, right? They believe in the greatness of humanity, right? The Scythians are cannibals. The Greeks are misogynist. They're misogynistic. As in their society ruled by men, right? The Scythians have Amazonians. Right? Okay, so how can we draw a parallel between how the Greeks view other people and how we view people in other places? Right? So let's think in terms of, if we were to draw a similar graph here, we were to think instead about us in the USA and how we view, let's say, people in Africa, what would our map look like? Or we could just do this more generalized and be like, because our other isn't specifically one place, so let's not limit ourselves. Let's do like Africa, Asia, Native Americans, etc., are sort of congealed other. Right? How would this work? How would we understand ourselves in comparison? What would this graph look? What are some characteristics we have that we're particularly proud of in the United States? What do we say about ourselves?
Freedom.
Freedom, which we could probably just steal a term from this chart and just move it on over, right? We're democratic. Are there parts of the world which we talk about a lot as not being very democratic? Where? What parts of the world do we associate with a lack of democracy? China, right? Which actually, like, China is a democracy. You know, they have representative government. They have free elections, you know, within a one-party system. But, you know, Mexico has a one-party system, too. Where else? North Korea. There's like a whole literature throughout like early modernity on Oriental despotism, right? Which talks about how it's impossible for Oriental people, right? And Oriental here meaning specifically Southeast Asian, and I'm not meaning to use a pejorative term. It's just the language that they used at that time, right? So basically, it's the people from Southeast Asia. It's impossible for them to be democratic, right? Because of this long tradition of despotism. Particularly, there's a lot of critiques of China early on by other Marxists in Europe that write about that. There's a really famous Marxist scholar named Wittfogel, and Wittfogel wrote a whole book about basically how Chinese communism couldn't be communism because of Chinese history of being inclined towards despotism, right? Having authoritarian leadership. Right? Any other places that we talk about in a similar way? There's a place, in the back of my mind, I think of a place that we fight a lot of wars recently.
Middle East.
Middle East. You hear people say this about people from the Middle East all the time, right? That Middle Easterners can't be democratic, right? That democracy doesn't have a place there, right? So, if we were to think about it like democratic, despotic. What else are we proud of as Americans about ourselves? You guys just don't think Americans are proud of themselves?
We like to see ourselves as like forward-thinking people. So like, you know, if we were the first ones to go to the moon, so we were like the first ones to like do that as a frontier.
Yeah, we're progressive, right? To some degree, like we're moving forward, right? Scientific, right? I don't mean progressive here in the specifically narrow sense of the subset of the Democratic Party that calls themselves progressives, but more generally, we view ourselves as a nation of progress, right? Advancement. How do we understand other parts of the world in contrast to that all? Can we think of examples of places that we think of differently? Yeah, go ahead.
They just, a lot of places don't have as many resources, like a lot of places in Africa or direct technology, whereas we have more advanced technology.
And how would we explain the lack of technology of people in Africa? Often. Most Americans, the average American. The average American doesn't exist, but I'm using it as a foil. We'll get into why that's a strange statement to be made by the time we get to nationalism, but. So the average American, what is the average American? Our foil for today. In some ways, our other today. How do they, like, can we think of, why would they explain the lack of technology in Africa? What do you think?
So because of the emphasis on individualism, it would be like, well, if you don't have technology, it's nobody's fault but your own type of mentality.
Yeah, to some degree, we would blame Africans for it, right? And then they don't value science enough. They're backwards and superstitious. They don't have the right kind of economy, right? They aren't developed, right? They're behind, right? So if you think about it, like, once again, which is, in a lot of ways, just a more polite way of saying what people were saying like in the 19th century, that they're savages, right? We just don't use the word. The language of development still assumes that in other parts of the world, there's sort of these backward savages. What else? What else are we proud of? What do Americans like to say about ourselves. I hope I'm not depressing you by like poking holes in our patriotic narrative. There's gonna be a lot of that in this class, just to warn you. What other things are Americans proud of? And I could have done this with any European nation as well, but we're all living in the geographic territory of the United States, so it's a little bit easier. You know, it'd be very hard if I was like, what do French people say about themselves? Because to some degree it would just be our assumptions, and which would probably actually be us using them as an other. So. What else are we proud of? I think we're kind of proud of our economy, right? I think a lot of Americans think that we really have economics down better than other countries, right? Or don't you think that's true? No one thinks that's true. So how do we understand our economy? What's an American economy supposed to look like? How should economic decisions be made? It's a phrase that just gets thrown around a lot. It's the free market, right? Free market should decide. We strongly believe, most Americans strongly believe in economic liberalism. This is regardless of which party you belong to. Generally speaking, Americans believe in economic liberalism, right? They believe in the free market. But once again, like, how would we view markets in other places, right? Well, if we're talking about Southeast Asia, we have a tendency to view it as being some, like, communistic, even though nowadays, in a lot of ways, like, most of the countries we would call communist practice a different form of free market capitalism, right? We would also have a tendency to think that other places are traditional, right, would be a term we use. Traditional is just code for backwards, right? You know, so we think that that's like they're being hampered down by their past, right? So it's sort of like our narrative when we think about it is we freed ourselves from our past, right? We you know, threw off our evil dictator in England. We developed a better, you know, we developed science, we developed economies, we went to the moon, et cetera, while other people in the world become our foil, right? If people here aren't despotic and backwards with an overly prescribed economy that's either traditional or communistic, then we cannot be these things. Do you get that idea? So like the idea is in the same way that the Greeks don't get to feel this way about themselves unless they think other people look like this, right? Do you get that? So this is one of the parts of the rhetorics of otherness, right? Is this inversion, right? That other parts of the world have to be our opposite. They serve as our foil. And in fact, so this is a general rule for when we use the term other, right? Or talk about difference. This language originally was created by a French philosopher by the name of Jacques Derrida. So Derrida. And one of Derrida's big phrases that he uses all the time is the trace of the other. Sometimes people talk about the trace of the invisible other, or an invisible other. Most of the time when we talk about ourselves, there's an implied other group of people out there. We may not, in this case, like, the other is very specific and stated. Sometimes we don't state who we're talking about, right? But if we say, you know, Americans are democratic, we imply just in literally the language of it itself, right, that other people are not, right? If we say that we are the greatest nation on earth, what does that imply about every other place in the world? Automatically.
They're not the greatest, that they're inferior to us.
Yeah, that they're not, right? And so every positive statement you can make about your identity, and this can be your national identity, this can be your racial identity, this could be, right, has implied beneath it, right, this trace of the other. Right? So another way to put it is, regardless of how you construct difference, difference is like usually meant hierarchically. Right? So when we started and we talked about this sort of polyethnic society and we were this week, right, and we were talking about race, like race is one form of difference and it's a hierarchical form of difference. Right? But there are other ways of doing that. So difference cuts across time. But difference always changes. We don't like you know, if you take like an anthropology class and you read about nomads, I've taught cultural anthropology before. I've never had people be like, oh, nomads. Nomads are horrible human beings. Nobody cares about nomads anymore, right? The Greeks cared about nomads, you know? But doesn't necessarily translate into our own form of difference, right? The form of difference that Greeks had grew out of what they wanted to say about themselves. In the same way that our own system, right, has its own rhetoric of otherness. All that makes sense? Cool. Any questions or thoughts so far about this as an idea? And this is particularly the rhetoric of otherness, of inversion. So Hertog actually has hundreds of these throughout his career. This is just me pulling out one of them. I'm going to pull out a few more before class is done today. No thoughts? Reactions? I'm not telling you to agree with any. This is my universal statement to every class. If I haven't made it yet, you'll hear me say this a lot. You don't have to agree with anything we bring up in here, right? You can think that like this is wrong, or you can think that it's a little too heavy-handed on people. If you think you can make positive statements about the group you belong in without inferring a negative other, like you can state that. Like that's okay, right? If you feel like anything we've talked about is false, like I want you to jump up and say it. Like it's a dialogue. I didn't write this book. I don't. I'm not going to be offended. There's a reason why I don't assign my own stuff. Right? Any thoughts? Just too much to digest and talk about all at once, or have we just beat a dead horse? I'm trying to feel you guys out. It's a lot harder now that I can't see your mouths. Okay, we'll keep on plunging forward. So that's one of his rhetorics, the inversion of otherness. Another has to do with, so there's a trap that, so I mentioned this saying, I have seen, I have heard thing, right? I said that Herodotus has this throughout his book. And one thing that Hertog picks up on in his reading of Herodotus is this idea that every time we talk about a place that's different, right? So like, if you go on, I probably asked this before, and I'll probably ask it again. Has anybody traveled to another country? Here, where did you go?
Ecuador.
Ecuador. When you came back from Ecuador and you told people about your experience, what did that feel like? How did people react?
They were like amazed at what I had like seen, like the pictures and things like that. Just how different it was.
So people were amazed. Anyone else travel someplace? And I feel like, oh, go ahead.
Mexico.
How did people react to when you came back?
That's pretty, I don't know.
This is kind of like the opposite reaction, like nobody cared when you got back from Mexico, as opposed to amazement.
It was a vacation, so they're like, oh, that was nice.
I know a couple of times, like, how long were you in Ecuador for?
Like 10 days.
10 days. I know that like when I've like studied someplace else and came back, every time like I think that I've had this amazing experience, and then I show up and like nobody actually wants to hear about it. Like nobody cares. Like, you know, I spent 3 months in a place that barely anybody had even heard of. Like, how many of you have heard of Dakar Synagogue? Yeah, nobody in this room, right? It's generally like, you know, I go to this place and I have all these neat experiences, and I think, well, everyone's going to want to, you know, experience what I experienced, right? And then you come back and it's like literally like nobody cares. Like, it's like I found that like I could talk about my experiences for like 2 days, and then nobody actually wanted to hear about it again. You know, and part of that is like our experiences are not super translatable, right? It's hard for us to describe what we experience, especially the more different what you experience is from everyday life and the place you live, the harder it is for you to communicate it to other people. It's a trap of language, right? So thinking about like, so, you know, when Herodotus goes to describe himself traveling all over these places and what he sees, no matter what, he has to do this sort of like active translation to make, so you have to transform the different. And this is a different, so like if you think about it, is anybody familiar with the word rhetoric before? A different use of the, so we were talking about rhetorics of otherness from Herford. What's the word rhetoric mean? Probably should clarify that before. You guys didn't talk about rhetoric in like speech class or philosophy or anything?
How you formulate phrases and words and how you use it to your own benefit, sort of, how you phrase an argument.
Yeah, if you think about it, like, yeah, normally we think of it, yeah, as the strategies you make, you utilize, right, to make an argument or to talk in public or something like that. Right? That's usually what rhetoric is. It's the study of that, right? And he kind of means this as like what are the decisions? What are the rhetoric that, so like these things, like a statement isn't just all of these things every single time, right? But we often make statements that fall into these various rhetorics. So we often, when we describe other people, we use inversion, right? Sometimes when we describe other people, we do this translation thing where we essentially make difference into something same. Because if something is truly different, you can't understand it. If it's completely outside of your worldview, it's foreign, and you can't understand it. If you've never seen it, you can't understand it. So it has to be made similar. It has to be made the same. You know, and generally description does that. So I'm going to share one of my favorite pieces of this book. So he's talking about this act of translation. And he takes, for example, the idea of a monster. And where does this idea of monsters come from? First of all, so the unicorn. I know it's a weird thing to start with, right? A unicorn, right? Does anybody know where the unicorn comes from? As an idea? It's just a description of a rhinoceros. Right? A description of a rhinoceros, artists paint the rhinoceros. Eventually, over time, with not very many people ever having seen one in Europe, it slowly devolves into a unicorn. It's kind of like a horse with a horn on its head. Right? That is the description, you know. And so, like, you think about that, like, here, somebody's trying to describe something that they've seen. It's very different, way outside human experience, right? And what do? They pull to something same. What's the result of that? This sort of monstrous combination of the two, right? And that's kind of his image. So when we translate things into something that's palatable to other people, when we talk about other places, we automatically construct this weird sort of patchwork fantasy world. Right? If we really want to, like, he wants to claim, if we really want to understand Herodotus, that's what Herodotus has done. He just kind of created this weird patchwork world through, and sometimes it's like through an active telephone, right? Like one traveler tells another traveler something, and he tells that same story to somebody else and tells that story to somebody else, and before you know it, there's an entire village of people who live off of the gold taken by ant-sized dogs, or dog-sized ants, right? And so his description of the monster, and I'm just going to read this aloud, right? So he says, difference thus reigns supreme. The problem is how to contain it. The image of what is unlike will be constructed in opposition to what is to be seen here. And by virtue of the very fact that it will be an unfamiliar combination of forms that are current here. Thus, the hippopotamus has features of an ox, a horse, even a boar. Yet, it is neither an ox, nor a horse, nor a boar. The monster is always a combination of elements which are familiar. And it is even desirable that every single element should be familiar so that the combination of them will be altogether monstrous. Thus, a description is authorized by the eye of the witness. Whether it be that of the principal narrator or that of the local or delegated narrator, I have seen, or he says that he has seen, the eye of the traveler is, moreover, in the position of a link connecting the heterogeneous elements that compose the various animals of there. It is he who sets up this combination and guarantees its veracity. And so it is he who produces all these monstrosities through his way of selecting and assembling what is visible. Were it not for him, the elements would not be able to hold together. So what's he describing here? In very academic prose. So first of all, what's the animal? Let's start with the animal. What animal is being described?
Hippo.
A hippo. How's the hippo being described? So if I had never seen a hippo, how would you describe it? What would you say about it? We can describe a different animal. You want to describe an elephant? Let's describe an elephant. What does an elephant look like? I've never seen one. Never heard of them. Elephants are completely foreign to me. How are you going to go about describing it?
I won't do the elephant, but I have heard a story about the giraffe. Now someone tried to explain this to me. It was like the body of a horse. The neck was that of a snake. I can't remember what they used for the head. But then the skin was that of a cheetah.
Of what?
Of a cheetah.
Of a cheetah. Yeah, and so if you were to think if you were to describe that, and I was to be like, okay, yeah, it's cool. I'm going to create an illustration, right, off of this guy's description of it. It would look something like this. I'm a bad drawer, right? Is that a giraffe? What would you describe that as? It's a monster, right? There's no other word for it. Why is that? Because a horse and a snake and a cheetah cannot be held together other than the fact that you stated that it was all together in the same animal. That's what Heratoc's describing, right? So, and if you want to think about this entire tradition in the ancient world of monsters, it's really just people describing things where nobody has a picture of it, no one else has ever seen it. And so when they describe things, they become these sort of crazy creatures. If you want to think about that, Heratoc's setting up a metaphor, just like what he was saying about the Greek inversions, right? You can also say this about the monster, right? The monster is essentially how we talk about the other. Why is that? So when you're in Mexico, where'd you stay?
Playa del Carmen.
What's it like?
It's nice, sunny. It's a beach.
So did you stay in a hotel?
It was a resort, so it was like right on the beach.
Okay, so what's the resort like?
It's fancy. I don't know, it's like a resort.
Did you go into town at all? No. How about when you were in Ecuador? What was it like? Where'd you stay?
We stayed in Quito and then we stayed on like all the islands of the Galapagos.
Oh, cool, cool. What was Quito like?
It was not like Kansas.
How so?
Well, like I've never lived in like a bigger city, so I was just kind of like taken aback with how, now that like there's a lot of people, but there's a lot more like people like out and about. I don't know how to describe that. Like it was like a culture shock walking on the street and seeing like vendors and like people just selling things on the street. It was interesting.
So how did the vendors differ from here?
They would yell at you from across the street. It kind of shook me up the first time. I didn't know how to act. Yeah.
So, and I'm not harassing you at all, because I gave you an impossible task. That's actually my point, right? So like, without having experience, like to some degree, like I've experienced being in a place where the vendor culture is very different, right, as well. Right? And if you've been in a place like that, you know what that sounds like. But like if you haven't, you would get this idea that vendors holler at you from down the street and chase you around the city. And that's a very frightening idea, right? Like that seems very intimidating. You know, if you think about it, like anytime we start talking about difference, if somebody doesn't have the same experience, or at least like nowadays we have the benefit of a lot of technology, right? So like in some ways, like we have more of a grasp of what's out there in the world, right? But also like, as we'll kind of see later on, there's also a trick to that sometimes causes us to have misinformation that can be just as bad, right? But like, at the same time, we have a little bit better plug. But when we actually get down to describing something that people don't even have like that, like, I've seen that in a movie or whatever link, right? We often end up creating a world that feels very different from the one we describe and is often a lot more frightening and scary, right? Do you see how that works? So this would be the rhetoric of, right, finding the same in the difference, right? Make sense? Okay, so any questions about otherness? We're going to use the term the other and the term difference a lot, and we're going to use it sometimes in different ways. So as we're going to see, like we are always defining our world in terms of some other, right? And that's actually like when we get into race, like what we say about other races has a lot more to do with us than it does the people we describe. And we'll see how that works as well. So, yeah.
So is there any way to talk about someone that's like from a different culture, like is there any way to state who you are as a culture without it having a negative connotation on someone else?
Yeah, I mean that is like a huge debate within the literature, to be honest. There's a related to Hertog actually is somebody by the name of Todorov. And Todorov wants to claim that it is very much so possible. But we have to get out of like some of our like knee-jerk habits Because we have a tendency to view same is good and difference is bad. Right? We have a tendency to view the world that way. When we don't, we really often just sort of take the same, or sorry, that was the wrong one. Take difference and turn it into the same. Right? So we have a tendency to really be offended by different ways of living and doing, and our only way of accepting people is to reduce that difference. Right? And so this is actually this is the problem with stuff like you'll hear a lot of things about multiculturalism. And so the problem with multiculturalism is it never really actually confronts difference usually. Right? And what I mean by that is this idea that you could just take people who have very different ways of living and just mix them in and everything is fine and you don't have to negotiate anything out is not really all that true. Right? In reality, there are things about other places that are going to offend you. And so really learning to be around and interact with people who are different, as well as learning to talk about people who are different, is really learning to embrace difference, right? And negotiate out those things that offend us, right? And so another way to put it is that relativism doesn't necessarily work as a strategy for working with other people, right? And so you see that in these sort of weird tensions about how we talk about difference. The world doesn't work that easily. So Todorov's whole project is how do you overcome that? How do you actually get to the point where you interact with people? Because if you start interacting with people who are different, there's going to be things you like about their culture, and there's going to be things that are really offensive. So I'll give you an example. I was friends with several Indian men when I was living in Mankato, and I really enjoyed their company, and I liked learning about their culture, and they'd make me tea, and we'd sit around for hours and BS, and it was fun, right? But there's things about their culture that I don't like. I don't like the way in which they talked about women a lot of the time. I don't like the way in which some of the Indian men would exploit other Indian men in business, right? And how they talk about that in a very proud way. I thought that was pretty weird, right? These were my friends, so I could overlook it, right? But it was something that bothered me a lot of the time when it happened, right? And that's the reality of being around people who are different. The reality is that there is going to be clashes in your stance on the world, how you view the world, what you do, and what you think is, and those are different for different people and different subsets of even our population, right? So what I mean by that is I've known people with multiple wives, and that doesn't bother me as much as if people talk about abusing people with their wives, right? It's when I was in Senegal, you can have up to 3 wives in a Muslim country often, right? I knew people who seemed to do just fine with that, and that people, and I'm not saying it's okay in a universalistic sense, right? So don't take this as Dr. Howman's up here saying sacrilegious things or something like that. This is not me denying sort of universal ethic of it, right? But in an immediate way, I am not as offended by it as other things that I've seen people do, right? That may be very different for you, right? So those negotiations happen depending on what part of the population you're in is going to play out very differently, right? And even we could take this conversation, right? And I've just described, this is sort of my doubt about Totoro, right? I've described the things that I'm uncomfortable with, and maybe that's actually created some really negative opinions in your heads, right? About the people that I'm describing. Even though I don't necessarily even have those, right? But nonetheless, that's what it would take for us to be able to get comfortable with describing the world. There's a whole other movement, which we're actually not going to look at this specifically, but has anybody ever heard of cosmopolitanism? Cosmopolitanism, in its contemporary sense, is sort of a reaction to that, much in the way that Totoro or Hertog's Rhetorics would be. It's a reaction to sort of multiculturalism as a concept. And so cosmopolitanism would argue that the breakdown of these sort of barriers between people are really important, but that only comes through, right, sort of people being physically present around each other. So if we think about that's another question, right? So in describing, maybe if we're just sitting around talking about it, that's not the best way to deal with difference. Maybe the best way to deal with difference is actually to interact, right? And that's when you can actually eke out, right, in this sort of like, if you will, in the public sphere, right, the place where you interact with these people, you can work out these differences as long as no one's capable of dominating over anybody else within it, right? As long as you have this sort of space where people can actually interact. So cosmopolitanism would view, and actually you could hear if we went back to our other reading in McNeill a certain like lingering feeling of cosmopolitanism, because it's been him, it's very positive just by the sheer fact, even with all the power and all the weirdness that's happening in his described ancient society, there's something just very positive for people in terms of getting along, that they live with each other and that they actually like recognize positive attributes with one another. So even if you're like going around kidnapping people and bringing them back to your country, like the fact that you're like, well, those people are great metal workers, so I'm going to take their metal workers, in and of itself has like a really weird identification, right? And once those people are living among you, like you can't help but change, you alter, right? So like cosmopolitanism would positively value that kind of mixing, A really mundane, less loaded example would be like, I love foreign food. Like, let me put that in scare quotes because it's like an otheristic sort of way of describing it, right? This is the fun part to some degree of this kind of language, is it's like trying not to say something that's wrong is almost impossible, so you find yourself constantly reaching, right? I like food that is developed in the United States by people from immigrant populations that come over here, right? Like, I like Korean food and Vietnamese food. I love some pho right now. It sounds great. I like, Indian food and so on and so forth, right? And you could think about it this way as like having all these people come over here has made American food a lot better. Like before that, American food was like this sort of like mass-produced variant of European food that's like weird airy white bread and all the other food is white in color, right? And then we have some charbroiled meat. Like that's American cuisine, which is good and it's great, right? But on its own, like it's a little repetitive, it's a little bland, right? You add a bunch of other things in there, and then all of a sudden our food culture becomes a lot more rich. If you want to think about it, like rather than sort of like a stir-in other, if we could live in a society that becomes this like conglomeration of different elements of different places, that would be beneficial for everyone, right? And that's sort of like a cosmopolitan ethic, right? Cosmopolitanism, if you will, offers a solution to this sort of like this system of otherizing, right? By the sheer fact that like of physical presence. We're gonna look at something that actually works a little similar to that towards the end of class once we get through this language a bit better, which is Bava's stuff, post-colonial work. Okay, other questions or thoughts, people? Concerns? Yeah.
Could you just define other again? Can you just say what the definition that you had and the difference between other and different?
Yeah, defining the other. So like, I guess like we could think of it this way as an other. There's more than one way of using this. So originally the other kind of comes out of this philosophical language that talks about things like, can I understand other people in general, or am I just sort of like trapped inside my own head, right? When I say words, does it actually correspond to anything that calls out in you, or is there just this giant chasm between us? So that's kind of where that language starts from, in attempting to overcome that. But you will see it used that way still in sociology as well. So you kind of have to be careful when you come across the word other, which way they're using it. But in the context that I'm using it here, the other is essentially a description of, I'm going to break the rules and use the word that I'm, form of the word that I'm giving a definition for in the definition. So, description of another group of people. By a dominant I'm going to say this because most of the time when we come across the other, and this is a little different than how I just described it, most of the time when we come across this concept, there's definitely a hierarchy in play, right? People buy a dominant group as, so the dominant group can understand itself. I know that's a really broad definition, but really, like, usually when the word other gets used, it can get used in all kinds of situations. It's usually what a dominant group says about groups of people. So these groups of people can be basically anything. Because like I said, difference cuts across all kinds of things, right? And there's often forms of difference that we barely even recognize existing within our society. There's some that are easy, like we understand that there's racialized difference, right? But other things like there's a whole literature on the otherness of people who are sick, right? So we often otherize people who are sick in various ways, right? As healthy people, we are in a dominant position within a hierarchy, and we prescribe certain things to ill people as a way of reflecting positively upon ourselves, right? The way we talk about the mentally ill, the way we talk about the disabled, the way we talk about women, the way in which we talk about poor people. All these things end up we use all these things as foils, others, right, to understand ourselves. Now, most of us fall into some dominant categories and some submissive categories, right? You know, like some of us in the room may be racially otherized. Some of us in this room may be otherized in terms of gender. Some of us might be in terms of like, you know, like I grew up a poor kid. I still have that identity to some degree. It's a negative identity for most people, because most people would assume that my family just made a lot of mistakes and like that's why they are what they are, right? Or like, you know, you have nationality, right? Whatever, right? All these things are some form other. But at its core, like there becomes like what we think of as normatively good, which is usually what's dominant. Does it make sense? I know this is really complex language, but like really like the more we use it, the more you'll get used to it and the more it'll make sense. And it's probably one of the predominant languages in contemporary sociology. Is this sort of like discussion of otherizing, of domination, of, right? And we'll add layers on. Okay, does all that make sense? Cool. So summarize where we're at. We looked at other forms of difference that predated race. So for next week, your first reading is going to be Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt is writing about the birth of racism, in particular in the context of colonialism. Right? So we're going to look at that next. We're going to look at what colonialism is and how this constructed race. We're also going to start our Collins book next week. So that'll be our second reading. So make sure you have that. Yeah.
So do we have like 3 or 2 posts? Because it was like first and second chapter of Collins.
Oh, just do one post for those two. Yeah, just do one post. No, only two. Yeah, I'm taking them as one reading, but you know, there'll be 2 chapters just because we want to get through the book. I always assign a monograph. I think it's really important that people learn to read books. I know that sounds really funny, but most of us don't really read nonfiction books on our own. And a lot of classes we don't really assign these anymore. Even though, like, if you go on, that's in some ways books and journal articles make up the plethora of recorded information that you can have access to, right? So it's really good to get used to reading them in the long form. I realize that it'll make a certain amount of repetition in the class because we'll be talking about the same book week after week for a while. Okay. Yeah.
Do we just write the same like paragraphs over what we want this to write last time for discussions?
Yep, the discussion's going to be the exact same structure every single time. So if you got to like, good job. Sometimes some of you had feedback written into it, so go and look on Blackboard and see if you have that. I would tell you exactly where to go on Blackboard, but yours looks different than mine, and I'm not really sure where it is. So if you have a hard time finding it, maybe contact IT and figure that out. But I gave some of you guys feedback, most of you not. And usually the feedback was just like, if I couldn't really tell that you read, quite a few of you for the reading for today, I did that. If I couldn't really even tell that you read it, I was like, well, you're probably a little thin. It's probably not really helping us to set up for discussing it, you know. So a few of you had that. So. Cool.
And that's due Sunday, right?
Yep, Sunday night every week. Yep. You guys, how'd you guys feel about the discussion post? Did that help you guys formulate your thoughts? Back to like, I'm beta testing it, so give me feedback. For those of you who's had me before, tell me if you like the pop quiz structure or the post structure better for learning. So I realize the discussion's kind of a little more work, but tell me which helps you more, right? So, okay. Any other questions? Great. Thank you guys. Have a good week. And we will get more and more contemporary as we move on. So if you took this class being like, I want to talk about Black Lives Matter, we're going to talk about it. We just got to like understand it.
Is the abstract due too? Is that on the
Is that due next?
It's next Friday.
Yeah. Oh, it's due Friday. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, we'll probably like wander out into the yard and break up into groups standing really far apart, so we can talk about it. Then we'll generate our topics from there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.